how do we acknowledge that we're in person?
Well, we could just rudely talk over each other in a
Exactly.
very direct way.
This is Let Me Sum Up.
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Tennant. Regular deep dive into No, let's not do that.
Let's do that.
Technically, you can talk over me at any time.
Yeah, but it's way more satisfying when I can stare you like in the eyes.
You can see a vein in your temple throb.
Yeah.
So we ruin this carefully sculpted audio experience.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I can report my two co-hosts are recording from exactly the same place because they're here with me in person in Melbourne. The marvellous Frankie Muskovich. Hello, Frankie.
Howdy.
And recreational painter of detailed fantasy-themed miniatures, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
I'm actually a hologram. I'm not really here at all.
Hey, on this week's show, we dig into Infrastructure Victoria's report on the role of gas infrastructure in a net zero emissions economy. But last fortnight's episode caused something of a stir on Twitter and some amazing feedback from our beloved listeners. We asked them what should be in a supercharged ISP, and what did they say, Tennant?
There was a lot of feedback. So one thought from Emma was that if we're broadening out what's in the ISP, we still need a no surprises scenario within it where we're only considering proven technologies with a track record. Emma's thinking particularly of hydrogen, and I would guess more the more speculative use cases for hydrogen than the production. But you could make the same point about, say, mass use of vehicle-to-grid technology to help stabilise the system. Great idea. Hasn't been done at scale. Maybe have a scenario where that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to think through what that would look like if you completely relied on technologies that are proven, that we're confident we can scale up now. It would look really different. There's a lot of, I use the phrase building castles out of clouds. There's quite a lot of that in the ISP. If you don't fall back on the cloud castles, what the hell does it look like? I'm not really sure.
Well, it doesn't get you to net zero. I'm pretty confident of that.
Yeah. And so in the exchange with Emma, we sort of unpacked that a little bit, and maybe it's the most plausible scenarios for each sector of the economy that are available to us. And in some places, like the building sector, there totally is technology that can be scaled up now. And in others, like hard-to-abate sectors, you might need to sort of build in a bit of green hydrogen and the like to get us there, even if there is some technological challenges to navigate, to incorporate it into this amazing cloud castle we're all going to be living in at some point in the coming decades.
The cloud castle's going to have a bit of DAC in it too. That's direct air capture.
That's right. Sucking air through the basement and spitting out carbon dioxide-free substance.
So, Frankie, what stood out to you? What were in the various forks of the Twitter thread that we were dealing with on Friday?
I really enjoyed this Twitter thread, and I seized on a tweet from Tom Quinn.
Yep.
Shout out to Tom. We've known each other a long time. He's at Beyond Zero Emissions these days. So glad you're a listener of this friendly pod. His suggestion was to see a combined hydrogen superpower and high electrification scenario. So I guess his rationale, which is pretty sensible, is that the hydrogen superpower scenario that the ISP includes assumes use of hydrogen in the gas network kind of writ large, and it kind of writes off the idea of electrification at the kind of scale that I think the central scenario envisages. So he wants to see those two things considered alongside each other, because also a high electrification scenario model would lead to a lot more rooftop solar being distributed as well at the sort of household and business level at the same time. So I think that's a pretty valid, solid scenario.
Yeah, it's totally plausible. The idea that one would be effectively decarbonising the bulk of the Australian economy via electrification, but a bunch of hydrogen co-located with industry.
Yeah.
And then, servicing an export market for economies where they weren't able to produce that hydrogen, the kind of scale or the cost that is going to see them through the transition. That sort of makes sense, doesn't it?
Well, it's probably more closely aligned to where, at least I would say, sort of people currently speculate how things might go with green hydrogen, where it won't be available at such quantities that you'd be just pumping it into the gas network. Like it would still largely be reserved for those higher uses, so for industrial processes or for export.
Yeah, totally. So the one that stood out to me, actually, I mean, they were all amazing. It was a really fun conversation last Friday. But Craig Memory made a really interesting point around just thinking about how you deal with who pays. So he's trying to start to think through the equity impacts of just the scale of transition and the cost of transition that we're going to be working our way through, and saying, popping it at upper levels to say, you know what, our task is to decarbonise urgently, but do that in an equitable way. And there's an argument, and a pretty strong one, that cost recovery from customers is not necessarily going to get us there. Perhaps there needs to be a reliance on government on consolidated revenue to subsidise that transition. And when you look at the history of Australia's energy system, that's kind of how we've done it in the past, right? Like, our electricity system, our gas networks, they've been built by largely state governments. Yep. And then, the idea of cost recovery is actually a relatively recent innovation in Australia's energy governance.
The heroic age of big government building big stuff had some pretty big opponents towards its end. The Franklin Dam dispute was, one manifestation of that. But it certainly did get big stuff built. Yeah. And the age that we're maybe at the twilight of now, of efficiency and rationalisation, of squeezing more value out of the legacy of heroic age of power number one, is maybe giving way to a new heroic age. And maybe in 20 or 30 years, we'll have, a new Keating-era national competition policy set of reforms, NEM Mark III, by that point, and will be about how do we get more value out of all these pumped hydro things and all these state-backed hydrogen schemes. But we've got a lot of building stuff between now and then.
Yeah.
So thanks to all of our listeners that were interacting with us on Twitter and chipping in on that really interesting question. I think it is one that is being grappled with within government, as well as within the broader group of stakeholders and advocates of which we're a part. I guess we watch this space because this is a live one. Like the topic of a supercharged ISP and the kind of scenarios that are plausible is definitely going to be a subject of discussion and debate over the coming months and years. Hey, shall we read a report?
Absolutely, and it's going to be a jaunty little trip through a very svelte and easily read and encompassed one.
Yeah, it really wasn't. Victoria's gas substitution roadmap has been raised so regularly on Let Me Sum Up, it has its own corner. But this week, the future of Victoria's gas network makes its way into the main show with Infrastructure Victoria's blockbuster report on the role of gas infrastructure in a net zero emissions economy. Released alongside the roadmap, this report was a key input into Victoria's thinking on the future of gas in our state and seeks to map out the various available pathways for decarbonising the gas network. Tennant, what did you think of the report?
Well, we have made the hipster choice, eschewing the mainstream roadmap and going for the deeper cut of the Infrastructure Victoria lead-in paper.
And can I ask whose fault is that?
That is the fault of friend or maybe enemy of the podcast.
I'm going to go with frenemy.
Rob Murray-Leach who suggested this report. It looked like it was a short, sharp 95 pages, but they were double pages.
Yeah.
He knew exactly what he was doing when he referred this to us. I'd be surprised if he's read it himself. I think he's sort of sought to outsource it to us.
At the very least, he has done some screenshots of some of the more exciting graphs and posted them to Twitter.
Okay. I'll allow it, but I will say it is on brand for us.
It is a little bit. I will put my hand up and say there was a svelte 40-page report on the agenda, and
Damn you, Luke.
It was on supply chains, and we talked a lot about supply chains last episode, and I was like,
I was ready for the supply chain conversation. I was so geared up for the 45-page report.
So I may be the frenemy of my own show tonight.
Just mine. I think Tennant was okay with it.
So anyway, this is a thing that we read. I found it very interesting. Tennant,
Yes.
What did you think?
It is very interesting. So Infrastructure Victoria were asked by the Victorian government to look into what's the future of gas infrastructure in the state, given the net zero goal, given all the money that's tied up in the existing infrastructure, and given all the opportunities available to use less gas or use gas differently or use different gases in the future. So they've provided a bunch of concrete recommendations for the Victorian government and a sort of a game plan or a map of different activities over time and over different regions of the state. They've commissioned a couple of modelling exercises to inform this, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. There is a 434-page modelling report underlying this that only I have been mad enough to leaf through. They've got a lot of findings, and they did public consultation as well, and they report on what the community had to say.
So I think when I looked at this, and I had spent a lot of time early on reading through the recommendations in detail, which is sort of the upfront bit of the report, and then when I got stuck into the modelling scenarios, I thought, like, I had a bit of cognitive dissonance. Like, are these modelling scenarios matching, like, is this the same report I'm reading, or are these two quite separate things? And I think what I was struggling with a little bit in the scenarios that are laid out, and there are 7 of them in this report, and they do acknowledge that in their interim report that was issued earlier on, there were 4 scenarios that they expanded on in the final. That pretty much all of them, doesn't matter which kind of technology mix they're modelling, result in a very large proportion of energy demand being met by renewable electricity.
Yep.
So effectively showing electrification in the order of 80 to probably between 75 and 90%.
75%. I'm looking at the graph now. It's 75% up to about 90, I reckon. I think you're right. With some sort of form of renewable gas sort of in the mix, but not very much.
No, and whilst all the scenarios are framed around which focus on a specific renewable gas and its impact is being modelled, the thing that was hitting me in the face was the amount of electrification that's sort of resulting across the board in all scenarios, and yet it's not a major focus in the recommendations in the upfront report. So, I think pleasingly, particularly for our dear friend Luke here, energy efficiency is very much a focus in the recommendations, which is really pleasing to see. But it doesn't go big on electrification in the sense of recommending incentives or a fast track towards that approach. It very much takes the view that we need the next decade to kind of see what the viability is like, for the couple of renewable gases it sees as potentially having a having in the...
Which are green hydrogen and biogas. From waste residues in various locations around the state. Yeah,
so it basically says we'll make a call on the kind of final feasibility of that in the early 2030s. But until then, the recommendations beyond what they have to say about the role of governments in supporting and focusing on a just transition and having more direct support involved for low-income and vulnerable households, doesn't weigh heavily into the electrification piece, despite it being, like, to me, quite a prominent kind of outcome of the modelled scenarios.
So one of the things that's going on here is that the Infrastructure Victoria feel like there's quite a bit of uncertainty about how good or bad hydrogen and biogas are going to turn out to be. Biogas, the issue is more that there's limitations to how much could plausibly be produced.
Yep.
And they reckon the practical upper limit is in the region of the equivalent of 25% of current state gas use. And there's also a cost competitiveness issue that they have. We should return to that because there's important stuff in the modelling and since. But also they think that, like hydrogen, there's lots of uncertainties. Just how easy or hard is it going to be to convert existing gas users to hydrogen? Where's the cost going to be able to get to? But also they're conscious, or they think that with electrification, the existing electricity grid's not ready for really big electrification yet. A lot of investment's needed in it. And also the existing grid is pretty dirty. And so the immediate benefits of electrification, they think, are not great. So there's a lot of do preparatory things, do studies, stop making things, stop locking in new gas infrastructure, do some electrification of more obviously beneficial or areas where the state has sort of a duty of care almost around low income or social housing. But energy efficiency does the most heavy lifting in their scenarios, even excluding the scenario called energy efficiency scenario. It makes the most sense in the near term because it's cutting costs and it's cutting emissions, and it's not super reliant on infrastructure or technological developments that haven't yet been built or proven out.
Well, it's the approach that makes sense regardless of what pathway you ultimately take, because of the task of transitioning the infrastructure, and there's a transition cost whether you go down an electrification pathway or whether hydrogen plays a greater role. Doing energy efficiency now has all of those obvious benefits. The thing that it's a glass half full, glass half empty thing. I think you're right, Frankie. Like they could have called these scenarios electrification with sprinkles of ammonia, electrification with sprinkles of green hydrogen. Like they could have all been called electrification scenarios with slightly different mixes of technology.
And they are technology scenarios. Like there's no scenario here for we don't try to go for net zero or anything about society or global markets or whatever. It's all hydrogen's really good or ammonia's really good or energy efficiency is really good. How does it play out if we make that different assumption about technology costs or relative costs of different technologies?
And there's actually vast swathes of work that sits outside of the scope of this report. Like they just say, well, look, we really don't have a good sense of the costs of transitioning just the electricity network to cope with all of this electrification. Somebody should do that. I would suggest probably that somebody could be Infrastructure Victoria in a future report. That might be a smart thing for the government to ask it to do. The thing that I did like, and this is like my glass half full thing, is this is the first time I've seen any government entity give a timeline for making a decision around a pathway around the gas network.
Yes.
So the fact that they said by 2030 you need to make a call on what we're doing, because if you don't make a call by then, it is implausible that we will hit net zero by 2050. And I think that's quite a significant statement. It gives us a time horizon. And I read like the front loading of work on, what can we do on biomethane and biogas and what can we do on supporting green hydrogen. Let's give it our best shot. Like, well, we've got 8 years. It's appropriate to make those investments. It's appropriate not to just simply assume that we've got all the answers right now. But in the meantime, let's do heaps of work to prepare for the electrification, because that's probably what we're going to end up doing anyway. So the energy efficiency is a part of that. Thinking about those equity issues is a part of that. Starting to deal with some of the skills and supply chain issues that will allow that ramping up. I guess the question is there actually that much uncertainty that suggests that, you know, that cautious approach is warranted?
So, I mean, to your question about what's the level of uncertainty, like, I think if you got a bunch of buildings industry people into a room, there's probably not that much uncertainty in that cohort about where they see the future going when it comes to the building stock. And there's a very clear preference and trend towards planning for electrification in that sector. The other thing I would just add in at this point, and, you know, the sort of framing around, whilst I think it's sensible to say absolutely, like, you know, some technologies need time to be either proven out or not, I think, you know, your hardcore climate folks who are, all, you know, pushing a focus on 1.5 degrees, and the fact that the energy sector is meant to be the easy one that goes first, and if analyses like these are bound around the prospect of achieving net zero around 2050, that kind of flies in the face of what some of the significant authorities have to say out there about which sectors of the economy can and should go further, faster, you know, and earlier than other parts of the economy. So I don't know. I mean, that was a little bit in my mind as I read this as well.
So there was something that I really liked about this report, and there's something that I think is a very big problem for it through no real fault of the authors. The thing that I liked is that it is trying to take a holistic, systems-oriented view of this transition. So there's a lot of people coming at the future of gas from a point of view of my house, what is the cheapest thing to do for my house? And I get this bit of kit or that bit of kit, and what are their relative costs? And I come to an answer, and that's what we should do. But there's an awful lot that happens outside of your house that supplies the energy and the infrastructure to carry the energy and the storage and all of that. And it's quite a tricky thing to weigh up all of those flow-throughs. And, you know, they may not have done it perfectly here, but they've had a go, and that's valuable. The thing that is problematic to me is that this is very much a December 2021 report. Like, that is when this was submitted to the government, and then it was some months later when the rest of us got to see it. And in the intervening time, two quite big things happened. One of them was that the integrated system plan that we talked about last episode was finalised, and that plan calls for, expects as its central scenario, the pretty rapid decarbonisation of the electricity system. And so some of the assumptions in here about how emissions intensive the grid is are now not representative of the central expectation. The other thing that happened was that some guy named Vladimir Putin invaded some place called Ukraine, and gas has gone completely burko since. And so a plan that is sort of saying, let's take some no-regret steps for the remainder of this decade before doing a big push next decade, plays very differently when gas is now, in Victoria, it is currently, as we speak, capped at $40 a gigajoule. In the other regions where it's not capped, the spot price is $50 a gigajoule or more. And when I dipped into the modelling report for this and did my little search for some key words, it's not entirely clear, but it looks like the assumptions are that the supply cost of gas, not necessarily the price, but the supply cost with production and pipelining, it is about $6.50 per gigajoule.
Right.
Now, they may have also been using price assumptions from the gas statement of opportunities and the ISP that were probably more in the region of like $10 a gigajoule. But that's cheap gas.
Yeah.
And we're facing years of apocalyptically high gas prices. So acting urgently is pretty important. So as great as the integrated nature of this thing is, and the fact that they've got a lot, like we should step through the regs, but they have done a lot of thought about all the levers open to government and the sequencing of doing them. But we might need to dial everything forward by as many years as we can, or we're just going to have to resign ourselves to paying a heck of a lot of money for heating our houses and running our factories for the rest of the decade.
The reality of what gas prices are going to look like for at least the next few years, and the fact that, as you say, the central scenario in the ISP sees us getting somewhere close to 90% renewable electricity in the grid by 2030. A couple of the central propositions in this document now no longer stack up as it relates to like the relative probability or prominence of having a focus on electrification in the near term. So I think that's a useful context for this. But I also really agree with your comments about this being a really thoughtful look at all the different levers.
Which goes to one of the other things that came out of this report, which was there was like a keen interest in doing that regional planning and about, the infrastructure.
Recommendation number one.
Well, indeed, the situation that exists around, existing network infrastructure, particularly existing needs for different sort of flavours of energy and energy infrastructure, because it is going to be a very focused story as we potentially move away from a interconnected gas system to one of regional networks. That goes to the story around biomethane and biogas and its availability, both the feedstock for biogas and also, its co-location with industry. Like we are moving to a world in which they're going to be super relevant considerations and does require a bunch of planning to happen very soon in collaboration with local communities and local industry about what those specific localised transition pathways are going to be. Like I think, we can work on the assumption there is going to be some hydrogen, there's going to be some biogas and there's going to be some biomethane in the mix. That could be a really localised story around different parts of the state. And getting down to that granular level detail I thought was a really productive disaggregation of what is a big high-level debate about what pathways we're going down. Well, what are we doing in Gippsland? What are we doing in the Western Districts? What are we doing in the outer suburbs of Melbourne where there's, some significant sort of clusters of smaller manufacturers? Like they're super relevant questions.
And one of the things that comes across in the modelling scenarios, there are some important differences between those scenarios in how much of different things gets built. One thing that's pretty consistent, though, is that the hydrogen usage is very localised. Like there's a little bit in some of their scenarios. There's some blending up to 10% of hydrogen in pipelines, but there's no all hydrogen pipelines. The hydrogen's made as close as possible to where it's going to be consumed. And then maybe it goes into distribution grids, maybe it's used directly by large users. So it's a different picture than sometimes emerges from other sources where there's pipelines crisscrossing the country carrying hydrogen. Well, not in Infrastructure Victoria's utopias.
I got a sense, reading between the lines, that they were much more bullish on the idea if you're going to scale up hydrogen production, do it in particular discrete applications like heavy transport and the like, rather than starting to muck around with the gas network, making upgrades which might ultimately, just increase the sunk costs in the network that, it may not be the most sensible thing to do in a context of significant uncertainty about the pathway forward.
And that feeds into one of their a part of their recommendation is about scaling up hydrogen and doing preparatory things for that. And a part of that recommendation is to do more work to consider a hydrogen target or a renewable gas target for the state, but they're really keen to say in that process that what you want to think about is a broad target that is about emissions outcomes or about renewable gas consumption from the state as a whole, and is specifically not a blending mandate because they want to be open to whatever the best uses for hydrogen or biogas are in the state. Maybe I'm giving spoilers now, but the Victorian government has signalled in its roadmap in response to this report and other input that roadmap version 2, the 2023 update, roadmap harder, is going to consider a renewable gas target, and that's going to be considerably crunchier as a policy debate than any of the things that are in the initial wave of actions that the state government's taking in the first version of its roadmap. Because if there's a hydrogen target or a renewable gas target, what's it going to cost and who's going to pay for it? I've got a dodgy spreadsheet that could opine on that, but I'm going to need to update it because $50 a gigajoule natural gas is not in my spreadsheet.
Victorian Government, you can reach Tennant at Tennant Reid on Twitter if you want to have insights into his dodgy hydrogen spreadsheet.
And unlike some consultants I won't name, mine's for free.
Hey, can we talk about the serious and welcome focus on energy efficiency?
I'm here for that, Frankie. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I want to kind of touch on, I want to say recommendations 5 through 8, I think.
Solid recommendations.
Solid chunks in there, right? So number 5 is basically telling us that energy efficiency is an immediate, no regrets strategy that should be rolled out at scale immediately, which is an extremely welcome call out. They also, and I've got to call up my notes here, but they identify 6 key strategies that they're calling on. I think they call high value energy efficiency opportunities. No surprise that a lot of those focus on buildings, but they also call up improved heat recovery and those upgrades to burners and boilers to make sure that gas can be burned efficiently. In the buildings context, as well as I think industrial, where there's low temperature applications, they call up heat pumps, so both air to air and air/water to water heat pumps, and it's your greatest hits of building energy efficiency interventions in draft proofing. Insulation, although there's some asterisks over insulation in terms of cost. I didn't really get the detail in question marks over that, as well as switching over cooking to induction.
And can we just call it the scale of the savings available through like what they describe as their 6 high priority, like just no regrets, no brainer options? They're talking about 112 petajoules in annual gas reduction by 2040, or 66% of gas demand, with more than half contributed by the residential sector in Victoria, which is remarkable.
It's big.
It is big.
And for comparison, the Integrated System Plan Central Scenario, as we were talking about last episode, projects by 2030 90 petajoules of electrification and 11 petajoules of energy efficiency related to gas across the whole national electricity market. So this is considerably more ambitious than that.
But in terms of decarbonisation pathways for the gas network, just good old-fashioned efficiency. And it's interesting how this is framed. Like, part of this is electrification, right? But it's efficiency via electrification and switching across that load, as we know, particularly with heat pumps. They're more efficient in their use of that primary energy.
Yep.
And so you get that dividend of doing the fuel switching, associating that load with renewable energy as time goes on, and just, solving so much of the problem without having to muck around with, hydrogen or ammonia or any of the other things that are floating around as more complicated scenarios. Spoiler alert, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council endorses energy efficiency as the pathway through this energy transition.
You heard it here first, folks.
Man bites dog.
But Frankie, there's even more recommendations.
There's so many more. I said recommendations 5 through 8 and I'm just getting started. Buckle up, guys. All right. The next one that I was really glad to see pulled out explicitly was around a just transition. Yeah. And I think the imperative of the government to have a much stronger focus and support for low-income and vulnerable households. So it specifically calls out that cohort. We've often talked about the risk in, like the prospect of high electrification scenarios and people exiting the gas grid and, effectively leaving less gas consumers on it to bear the network costs, which would therefore increase. And it's a, particular risk for this cohort who are often less empowered to make those decisions because they occupy rental housing and also spend disproportionately higher amounts of their disposable income on energy costs. So the report makes some pretty strong recommendations on what to do from an efficiency perspective to support low-income and vulnerable households. It specifically calls out rental standards and improving the energy efficiency of social housing as well. It also, it sort of calls for the immediate increase in scope and scale of existing energy efficiency programs, targeting those cohorts, noting that some do exist. And then the interesting one for me, per our kind of previous conversation on electrification, is that they suggest that there should be a mandate for all electric appliances in new social housing to minimise energy bills. So there's sort of tacit acknowledgement here that in new housing, all electric options are cheaper and perhaps will only be borne out more if we were to upgrade the assumptions around gas pricing used in the modelling. They also recommend the government basically doing what they can to remove all or most costs for that cohort to electrify and move off the gas network. Pretty significant set of recommendations there to focus on a vulnerable cohort. I thought it was really great to see that as a focus, and it makes sense that Victoria would, be the leaders in that debate because it's the most gas reliant from a housing perspective across the country. Victoria uses a lot more gas for heating and hot water in homes than any other state.
It's a call for some better targeting of even the programs that currently exist in Victoria. So in other states, in South Australia, for example, they've got energy efficiency schemes and they've got a percentage that need to address vulnerable households, which is not something that we have in Victoria in the same way. I think that there's growing momentum within some of the advice that's been given to the Victorian government, some of the actions the Victorian government is taking. They can see that as we move through the next 20 years, this is going to be one of the critical success factors, bringing these parts of the community along for the journey, and it's going to be really hard, and they need to start ASAP.
Yep. And before we move off our focus on efficiency and electrification onto communications, because I know you want to talk about that. But the other recommendation I really liked in the detail it provides on the landscape in Victoria specifically was around removing barriers to electrification. So we talked about the fact that the Infrastructure Victoria doesn't go as far as suggesting widespread acceleration and incentives to drive acceleration this decade of electrification. But what it does suggest is immediately removing requirements for gas infrastructure and gas connections in new developments, that currently act as barriers to all electric developments for those who want to do it. So there's a few things brought up in this recommendation that are super interesting, including this is the first place where I've actually seen very kind of niche and obscure elements of the Victorian planning system highlighted that, until very recently, resulted in, gas connections being viewed as required for new developments through some, sort of rather obscure elements of plumbing regulations even.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it's in this recommendation they encourage the Victorian government to consider by 2028 just, phasing out gas in new homes entirely.
Yes.
That's right. And the earlier bit of the recommendation, the alter these niche elements of the planning systems and the codes so that gas is not mandatory on new builds, was actually taken up. It was one of the parts of the gas roadmap that directly refers back to the recommendations here in the Infrastructure Victoria report. So, a nerdy niche focus can get results, which will comfort listeners of this podcast.
So I thought this part of the report in the recommendations did a really good job at summarising the status quo in terms of where the incentives and disincentives and barriers lie, and made some really common sense recommendations to remove those barriers, because if it is indeed more cost effective for a given project proponent to want to pursue an all electric building development or other project, they shouldn't be required to connect to the gas network to comply with planning provisions. And that's a very good, no regrets, common sense change to enact right now.
So we round out our tour of super smart energy efficiency / electrification recommendations with recommendation 8, invest in the statewide communication, education, training and behaviour change programs.
And this is basically, for Victorians with long memories, this is basically resurrecting the Black Balloons campaign. They're just proposing mass comms, clear messages that convey the impacts from inefficient energy use, which was done years ago and is still a good idea. The facts have shifted a bit. The context is a bit different, but you do need some clear messages, and this 180-odd page report is not going to be... Even you, listeners of this podcast, are not a large enough cohort of yourselves change Victorian energy use. So a wider campaign is definitely needed.
And behaviour change to encourage. It's not just an awareness piece. It's they're actually very intentional about creating a campaign with longevity that will change behaviour over time, not just make us more well informed, about the amount of greenhouse gas emissions being released into the atmosphere when we do our stir fry on a Friday night, on our gas heated woks. So there's definitely I think a very intentional focus on the cultural shift that's required here. And I really liked the fact that they called out the necessity of a long-term focus and regular funding for campaigns like this, where it's not an argument you're going to win overnight. I think that the example they gave wasn't the black balloons one, but they called up another area of public policy in the Transport Accident Commission, the TAC's long-running campaign towards zero around eliminating road deaths, which was run over a very long period of time and quite successfully.
If you pay $40 a gigajoule for gas, you're a bloody idiot.
Is that a commentary on your members?
If you think we ought to pay $40 a gigajoule for gas for the remainder of this decade, good luck to you.
All right. As always, we close out our show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. And Frankie, despite you berating us for our downbeat one more things in past podcast episodes, I understand you have something slightly depressing to share with us today.
Well, I'm keeping us in the broad realm of gas, and I'm calling it Gas Crisis Corner, specifically European Gas Crisis Corner. I know we've talked a bit in this podcast over the last few episodes about what's happening in Europe and the imperative for a lot of EU countries to diversify and move away from Russian gas as quickly as possible to sanction their behaviour and the war that they're waging in Ukraine. And so, Luke, you and I were in Germany recently. We heard on the ground from policymakers in Berlin that they were preparing for the very real possibility that come this European winter, the tap might get turned off. That actually they might be facing shortfalls in supply, and the government is and has been making plans on what would happen if that were to eventuate, and had said to us, households remain the priority, and gas would be reserved for heating homes to make sure that people would be safe through winter, but that businesses and manufacturing that is deemed non-essential could very well face the prospect of not having gas, which effectively means they wouldn't be able to operate in many circumstances, which is a pretty scary reality. So, I mean, my one more thing is that some of this fear is starting to eventuate in the behaviour of the Russian energy company Gazprom, which I think on Monday has come out and said that they are halving the natural gas flowing through Nord Stream 1, the main pipeline, to Germany. So that's going to be operating at 20% of capacity, down from 40% capacity. And Gazprom is, making some claims about problems with a turbine that sort of...
With Canada or something like that?
Yeah, that's been in Canada for repairs. And now, and Europe sort of said to Canada, hey, Canada, send us the bloody turbine back so they can stop pointing to that as an excuse for not sending us gas. I think the worst of the worst in terms of what countries like Germany have been planning for seems as though it's starting to eventuate, and that they are facing very real downturns in the amount of gas that's going to be available now and in the months leading up to winter. So I think watch this space. Yeah. That's going to add more urgency onto an already incredibly urgent environment of policy making to find alternatives to Russian gas, be that different sources of natural gas, and ramping up their shifts away from gas altogether.
Dare I say, on the other podcast, First Fuel, we just released an episode where you and I and Carlos Flores went deep on that. So that's the second part of the bumper two-part episode that we flagged last week. Do you believe this whole Canadian gas turbine situation? You sound somewhat sceptical.
No, it's a total furphy.
Unfortunately, it is not possible to provide gas through pipeline at this time. Perhaps an arrangement could be made.
If only there was a way of transmitting Tennant's complimentary hand gestures to that ridiculous accent through your phones.
Honed through many readings of Eloise in Moscow. To my child.
Classic. All right. Okay, we're sceptical of Russian stories around Canadian gas turbine malfeasance. Tennant, what have you got? Something more upbeat?
Well, look, you couldn't get more upbeat than a rewording of Boney M's Rasputin to comment on the Ukraine-Russia gas situation, but I'm not going to do that. Maybe in the show notes.
Come on.
Oh, you tease.
Instead, I'm going to highlight a cracker of a speech that was delivered recently by Secretary of the Treasury, Stephen Kennedy, on the theme of the relationship between the public service and academia, but he chose to focus on a potted history of climate policy development in Australia. And Steve Kennedy has been at the heart of that. He was the economics advisor in the Rudd Prime Ministerial Office, where he dealt with extreme pressure with immense grace. He is a lovely guy. He was the senior public servant in charge of introducing and then repealing the carbon price. And he's been at the heart of the NEG and a lot else since. So very thoughtful guy, great set of remarks, really thought-provoking and some colour and context. But interestingly, he situates the upgraded safeguard mechanism that is the new government's policy quite explicitly as a baseline and credit scheme for emissions reduction. He distinguishes it from former carbon prices and proposals for them, but he's quite clear in calling this an economic instrument of a kind that does put a price on carbon, albeit in a different way to before. So well worth having a look at that speech, and we'll put it in the show notes.
Fabulous. Sounds amazing.
And Luke, what is your one more thing for this week?
I wanted to flag a milestone in the journey of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, which is the formal expansion of its remit to cover energy efficiency and electrification. This is something that sensible people on all sides of politics have thought was a good idea for some time. It has gotten caught up in argy-bargy around reg changes related to more controversial things like CCS, to name one, that were prosecuted by the previous government. This has now gone through as a relatively straightforward reg change, clarifying ARENA's role moving forward, and it seems to have been a largely uncontroversial move. Something that we talk a lot about is the fact that, you know, the energy innovation challenge of the 2020s is different to what it was in the 2010s. Costs of renewables have crashed. It is much more of an integration piece. It's much more about what's going on behind the meter. If you've tuned in to any recent episodes of Let Me Sum Up, that, obviously dominates our thinking about how end use interacts with generation is kind of the whole box and dice moving forward. And so the idea that ARENA has an explicit mandate to think about energy efficiency, and when we say energy efficiency, what we really need is energy efficiency, energy management and demand response, load shaping, all of that fun stuff, and doing that within the context of electrification means that they have these shackles off and can now do some really exciting stuff on the demand side. My only caveat is that they need more money, because they've got more stuff to do and the same budget envelope. And so we'd be very hopeful, I think, that the federal government gives that some consideration in the upcoming October budget. All right, well, I have one more thing, which is that
Scandal.
We have been trying to remember to encourage our dear listeners to do things that will help us spread the good news of Let Me Sum Up.
As you were.
Thanks, Frankie. So we all listen to podcasts. Apparently you listen to podcasts too. It is a thing that is regularly said that rating us on Apple Podcasts or writing a review could be helpful to spread the good news of all the wonderful work we're doing here on Let Me Sum Up. Tennant, What do you think about this plan? Is it something that our listeners should do?
Like and subscribe, rate and review. It will bring this podcast to people that you like and want to bring some energy and climate policy report light into the lives of. So do it. Do it now. There's no time like the present to like, subscribe, rate and review this podcast.
So what you're saying is that they should like, subscribe, rate and review.
Send this podcast to friends. Send it to, as I heard Ezra Klein say, send it to an enemy if you didn't like it.
Send it to an enemy. Okay. This is going to be like one of those email chains where they have to send the podcast to 10 people to avoid a curse, is it?
Look, all I have to say is that one person in suburban Melbourne failed to rate and review this podcast, and the next day they were struck by a comet and erased from existence. So if you don't want that to be someone that you know, then you'd better pass this podcast on to them.
To 10 people.
To 10 people that you like and respect.
Maybe deposit some Bitcoin somewhere.
This promotional push cannot possibly fail.
No.
That is all we have time for on our show today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at
Frankie Muscovich.
Tennant is at
Tennant Reid.
And my handle's at Luke Menzel. And you can email us with feedback or something you want us to cover on a future episode at mailbag@letmixemup.net. Never miss an episode by subscribing, liking, linking, all of the things in your favourite podcast app. And you can find this and all previous episodes at letmixemup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll
speak to you soon.
Very soon. Well, that sounded a little sinister, actually.
Unless the comet gets you first.
I think this episode's going to sound a little different.
Just a little.